I'm back. Hooray! And this time, I have Miles. He's so sweet and so needy. So today, I'm going to be reading out of the Oxford Companion to Jazz. This was my book when I took jazz history, which was one of my favorite courses of all time. And so we're going to be reading African Roots of Jazz from Samuel A. Floyd Jr. This book is an anthology of various articles about jazz history. It's enormous. So there's that. So there's plenty of good stuff in here. I will be uploading this to YouTube later if you have students that you'd like to share it with. And if I mispronounce anything, please forgive me. I can already tell on this first page that I'm going to mispronounce a lot of things. But yeah, so let's all learn something together, I guess. So again, we are reading African Roots of Jazz from Samuel A. Floyd Jr. Okay. African American musical practices in the United States cannot be traced directly to specific populations in Africa with any degree of certainty, but it is possible to document certain general practices that are common to music in Africa and to black music in the United States and widespread in both. Thus, we can draw reasonable conclusions about possible relationships between musical practices in Africa and those among jazz musicians in the United States. It can be hypothesized, for example, that's Miles rubbing on my iPad. Yep, okay. It can be hypothesized, for example, and determined to a high degree of certainty that particular musical tendencies were brought with Africans to the New World, preserved within and outside the dancing ring of slave culture, and spread throughout African-derived populations in the United States, eventually becoming an integral part of the music we now know as jazz. Oh, that's me dropping things. Miles, come here. Miles. Baby, come here. Okay. Now I have to deal with the cat. 1 second. Okay. Hi, baby. There. You sit here. Say hi, everybody. Say hi. Yes, the cat is named Miles Davis. Duh. Okay. Back to our book. In traditional Africa, spiritual divinities were part of the daily lives of entire societies. Known among the Yoruba or Orisha, and in other cultures variously as Abasam or Ashanti, Vodun or Fon, and Alos or Igbo. Miles, stop rubbing on the iPad. Come here. Just stay here. These gods influenced the conduct of human affairs, arbitrarily created ill or goodwill, helped or hindered individuals and the group, informed or limited the knowledge of populations, and interacted with each other. Among the... Ow, I got claws in my knee. Among the Yoruba's other numerous deities, for example... Oh, I'm going to mispronounce this one. Olodumare was senior, known as God, creator of the universe. Or Luna was the diviner and symbol of wisdom. Akozi was the divine hunter, and Isu, also called Ishu Legba, Isu Elegbara, Ishu Elegua. See, now you can see him rubbing on the iPad. Thanks, guys. Was an inveterate prankster who occasionally caused havoc in the lives of believers. For traditional Africans, these divinities, that was the cat jumping down and falling on something. For traditional Africans, these divinities dwelled in the material and the non-material or spirit worlds, and were an essential part of ritual in the societies that believed in them. In sacred rituals, these deities mount and take charge of human hosts who dance to the songs and rhythms that the divinities are said to own. imitating their character and conduct. Thus, in highly stylized and controlled theatrics, the hosts become mediums who mime the character of their riders. Africans say it is not the hosts who do the dancing, but the divinities themselves. In these rituals, possession is brought on by drumming, chanting, singing, and persistent and energetic dance in the form of mass dancing, team dancing, small group dancing, 2, 3, or 4 people, and ring dancing. In many African societies, this dancing took place in the dance ring. It is a symbol of community, solidarity, affirmation, and catharsis. And also in formations that were linear, circular, semicircular, or serpentine. A drawing in T. Edward Bowdish's book, Mission from Cape Coast Castle to Ashanti, shows a marching band in Africa in ritual ceremony, with the author explaining that the participants presented themselves to the king, formed and moved around a circle to the music of more than 40 drums, and made salutes to umbrellas. Francis Baby, in his African Music, A People's Art, discusses funeral processions in which the music could be celebratory, with sounding trumpets and drums showing vigorous respect for the deceased. In some of the burial ceremonies themselves, trickster tales are told. The dead, who are susceptible to humor and excitement, are said to like such stories. In at least one country, Suriname, versions of the Ananasi trickster tale, for example, were told during burial ceremonies to amuse the spirit of the deceased. The significance of these tales to a discussion of African influences on jazz music lies in fact that they contain features that are shared with other African performance tradition, indirection, argument, and opposition, as well as overlap, apart playing, and interlock, as Roger Abraham points out in his African Folktales, Traditional Stories of the Black World. These oral practices would come to be as effective in jazz music as they are in vocal narrative. In processions and in the line and ring dances of African burial and other stationary ceremonies, the rhythms of the music were accompanied by shoulder and head movements, foot stamping, hand clapping, and vocal shouts that animated the performances. Among the Akan, young children imitated the steps and movements of adult dancers, moving along the fringes of the ring and behind it, according to musicologist J.H. Kwabena Nikitia and his Drumming in Akan Communities. By observing and studying such activities, we have come to better understand the nature of shouting in African American ring ritual and its derivatives. Shouting has implications for the origin of the second line of New Orleans jazz funerals, and for the origin and nature of scat singing in early and later jazz music. For example, Louis Armstrong's vocal imitations of instrumental melodic improvisations, as in his Heebie-Jeebies of 1926, and the rifling calls of Cab Calloway's Heidi Heidi Hoes. The rhythmic elements of African American music were derived from African timeline practices in which the instruments of ensembles play multilinear rhythms that yield characteristic interlocking, cross-rhythmic, 2 or more contrasting rhythms played simultaneously, and polyrhythmic, 2 or more rhythms played simultaneously, musical configurations. Performed most frequently by a clapperless bell called the gankogui, a steady asymmetrical background rhythms are sounded continuously through dance performances. Gerhard Kubik, in his article entitled Analogies and Differences in African American Musical Culture Across the Hemisphere, Interpretive Models and Research, which appeared in Volume 18 of Black Music Research Journal, has given examples of such background rhythms or timelines. See page 11. We'll look at page 11 in a minute. In African American music, especially in jazz, timelines became asymmetrical, for example, 2-2 rhythmic relationships, rather than asymmetrical in the form of various underlying divisive pulses, riffs, and ostinati. and in most cases, less persistent and consistent. Nevertheless, the African timeline concept, in attenuated and modified form, virtually defines the rhythmic basis of African American vernacular music and jazz. Together, the bell and other instruments of African ensembles, with their resulting multilinear rhythms, comprise what Nikitia, in the music of Africa, has called little tunes. Regarding tunes in the form of singing, Alan Lomax, in his article entitled Africanisms in the New World, which can be found in the Haitian Potential, edited by Vera Rubin and Richard P. Schendel, demonstrated that across Black Africa there exists an extraordinary homogeneity of African song style that, in part, is textually repetitious, slurred in enunciation, lacking in embellishment and free rhythm, low on exclusive leadership, high on antiphony, chorally, especially high on overlapped antiphony, high on one-phrase melodies, and highest on polyrhythmic or hot accompaniments. That African music generally is repetitious, cohesive, overlapping, or interlocked, multi-leveled, and hot. Despite the generalizations contained in Lomax's statement, to which exceptions may prevail depending on the specific locations in which Africans happen to reside, this song style, together with various African speech patterns, comprises the verbal basis of African melody and rhythm. Bebby has observed, for example, that in Africa, the primary purpose of the instruments is to reconstitute spoken language. According to Barbara Lee Smith Badachan, in her American Diary 1957-1958, many African peoples imitate instruments with their voices and add peculiar musical sounds at the end of the verses, a practice that probably grew out of some African peoples' propensity to speak the last words or syllables of musical phrases, which is probably related to their propensity toward elision and results from the tendency of these people to mirror in their singing the rises and falls of the pitches and pitch inflections of their regular speech. Some of these practices are undoubtedly sources of the blue notes, elisions, and other melodic assets of African American singing style. Other characteristics of traditional African music, ranging from the simple monophony of Watusi warriors to the complicated melodic polyphony, two or more melodies sounding simultaneously, of the Pygmies of Central Africa, make use variously of melodic monophony, one melody without accompaniment, heterophony, a single melody sounding simultaneously in two voices or instruments, one or each containing modifications that depart from the original, and polyphony, parallel thirds, overlapping call and response events, and Kibede points out, tongue clicks, section stops, explosive endings, throaty gurgles, and hand clapping with offbeat syncopation. In African calls, says Bebby, communication is made effective by the intonations and rhythmic onomatopoeia of speech, with African singers producing sonorities that are unusual and powerful through the use of head and chest voice, stammers, inflections, and sonic characterizations that depict aspects of African life. Nikitia, in the Music of Africa, says although rhythm is the primary focus of drumming, some attention is paid to pitch level, for the aesthetic appeal of drumming lies in the rhythmic and melodic elements. Ollie Wilson goes further, stating in his article entitled The Heterogeneous Sound Ideal in African American Music, in New Perspectives on Music, Essays in Honor of Eileen Southern, edited by Josephine Wright with Samuel A. Floyd Jr., that the rhythm motives of the drums and the pitches and contrasting timbres that produce them create mosaics of tone, color, and pitch, which constitute a heterogeneous sound ideal. This sonic ideal results from the interaction that takes place among all the performing forces in an African ensemble, among, depending on cases, solo voice, chorus, hand clappings, and the rhythms of idiophones, hard surface instruments played by striking, aerophones, wind instruments, and chordophones, stringed instruments. In the resulting tonal music, drum, rattle, bell, voice, and hand claps not only contrast but commingle in a sound complex that is unequivocally African. This African sound, which is reflected also in strictly vocal music, was brought to the Americas and came sonically to define the music of dance rings throughout the New World. In locations and situations which enslaved Africans were denied use of the drum, and even outside such locations, they patted juba, a practice that among its various versions, the hemiola of the hambone pat, making use of the hands to drum upon thighs, chest, and other body parts. The Juba pat was an extension and elaboration of simple hand clapping that evolved to become a complete and self-contained accompaniment to the dance. The values of ancestor worship, trickster devices, and other symbolic practices of African culture, together with African timeline patterns and vocal and instrumental procedures, were preserved most effectively and shaped to the Africans' new circumstances in New World versions of the ring shout. It was from this cultural phenomenon that the elements of African American music would emerge: calls, cries, and hollers, call and response devices, additive rhythms and polyrhythms, heterophony, pendular thirds, back and forth movement between notes 2 steps apart, blue notes, bent notes, and elisions, hums, moans, grunts, vocables, sung sounds and words devoid of meaning, and other rhythmic oral declamations, interjections, and punctuations, offbeat melodic phrasings and parallel intervals and chords, constant repetition of rhythmic and melodic figures and phrases, from which riffs and vamps would be derived, timbral distortions of various kinds, musical individuality within collectivity, game rivalry, hand clapping, foot patting, and approximations thereof, a part playing, and the metronomic pulse that underlines all African American music, all coming to manifest themselves in the shuffling, angular, offbeat, additive, repetitive, and intensive, unflagging rhythms of jazz. Let's see how long this is. No, a couple more pages. Okay. The most popular and ubiquitous instruments of slave culture, the banjo, flute, triangle, drum, quills, and sticks, or bones, were well suited to the realization of the rhythmic and tonal stratifications of the heterogeneous sound ideal, as it would be made manifest in African and African American music. This phenomenon played a critical role in determining the nature of jazz in the following ways. Melodically, this sound ideal is manifest in microtonal inflections in pentatonic and modally ambiguous contexts. In singing, voices that are sometimes and variously rough, sandy, piercing, and falsetto. In wordless sounds that are sometimes used for their own value rather than for communication of verbal meaning. In ease of movement between speaking and singing, and speech-song, and in the use of ululations, grunts, hums, shouts, and melismas as integral and indispensable parts of the musical meaning. Rhythmically, this phenomenon manifests itself in hand clapping, foot patting, patting juba, in the repetition of short rhythmic motives, cross rhythms, accented in isolated second beats, and in basing, repetitive accompanying phrases. Textually narratives, told in dialect and in call and response, are presented in metaphor, figure of speech, implication, indirection, and personification. In jazz music, the African musical practices of heterophony, call and response, riffing timelines, cyclic structures, additive and cross rhythms, intonations, and onomatopoeia became widespread, although transformed and somewhat attenuated. And given the African insistence on heterogeneous sound blend, The specific instrumentation of the early jazz bands, clarinet, trumpet, trombone, tuba, banjo, and drums, may have been influenced as much by the preferences of transplanted Africans as by the instrumentation of European-derived band sections. African Americans used European musical instruments to synchronize kitty. Whoop. Let's see, where were we? Ouch. Okay. Now we're settled again. He's purring. African Americans used musical instruments to syncretize a timbral mosaic that, together with other elements, came to be recognizable as the sound of jazz. The call and response device is found in extended form in the 12-bar blues of U.S. provenance, in which, for example, a 2-measure instrumental response answers a pair of 2-measure vocal calls, comprising a sonic mimicry that creates the illusion of speech or of narrative conversation, and in jazz, in call and response style riffs. Thus, jazz, like African music, possesses a telling effect that Albert Murray, in his The Hero and the Blues, says asserts, alleges, quests, requests, and implies, mocks, groans, concurs, and signifies misgivings and suspicions, with the performance making use of what Dominique Zahan, in his book, entitled The Religion, Spirituality, and Thought of Traditional Africa, refers to as implication, euphemism, symbol, allegory. In jazz, as in African music, where dancers perform, with, in the African way, a bump here, a grind there, a nod there, a nod and a dip elsewhere, they are responding to what the musicians play on their instruments. Similarly, the musicians react to the movements, gestures, and urgings of the dancers. In their dances, Africans pantomimed the poetry of African song. In this tradition, gestures are symbols, and artistic practice is judged according to aesthetic and ethical sensibilities that balance the good and the bad, the true and the false. Among the Yoruba specifically, according to Babatunde Lawal, in his article Some Aspects of Yoruba Aesthetics, which appeared in Volume 3 of the British Journal of Aesthetics, performing artistry is judged by the quality of a presentation. A good singer or poet is judged not only by the quality of his voice, but also by the quality of his composition. And with drumming, artistry in music is recognized by the individual's ability to talk with the drum and in the overall rhythm or melody of an orchestral performance. In Yoruba aesthetics, judgment is consensual, shared throughout the community. It is for these reasons, among others, that in performance settings, jazz musicians and dancers react so effectively to one another that jazz musicians rely so comfortably on their audiences for critical evaluation. It is also why jazz audiences communicate their approval and disapproval of artistic gestures and other realizations of aesthetic form through vocal encouragement, silence, or sometimes good-natured mocking. Over the 3 centuries in which African musical practices and assumptions were transformed into new structures and ideas, molded in a process in which European instruments, forms, and practices were superimposed on a foundation of transplanted African cultural preferences and practices, black musicians performed on the violin, banjo, musical saw, reed flutes, drums, where and when they were not prohibited, sticks or bones, and rattles of various kinds. They sang rhyme songs, songs of satire, derision, and mimicry, songs of nostalgia and nonsense, children's songs, lullabies, and songs of love, all with a humor that served as their armament in a struggle for life and liberty. Through it all, there was present the heterogeneous sound ideal, the contrasting conglomerate that is so well suited for the rhythmic, polyphonic, and tonal stratification of jazz. In jazz, African musical practices such as timelines, the song style techniques described by Lomax, the calls, the cries, and hollers, the game rivalry, onomatopoeia, and all the rest are performed within a context that has been described by the Thomas brothers as solo and cycle. In his article entitled Solo and Cycle in African American Jazz in Musical Quarterly, Brothers offers a theoretical model for analyzing jazz along the lines that echo the position that Richard Waterman took in his article entitled African Influence on the Music of the Americas in a Culturalization in the Americas, edited by Soul Tax. That is, early Africans in the United States must have considered European musical ideas as a source of material to be explored within a generalized African musical context. Viewing Waterman's position as a hypothesis to prove, Brothers uses as a point of departure Southern U music, with its division of ensemble and performance into two rhythmic groups, a variable group and a fixed group. He then identifies the harmonic solo and cycle in jazz performance and analogous to the variable group and fixed group in Southern U drumming. Brothers has discovered that although the harmonic cycle in jazz is organizationally slightly different than the U rhythmic cycle, both produce and are dependent upon the same syntactical model. He cites Louis Armstrong's solo on Big Butter and Eggman as an example of how pitch is used to articulate temporal relationships in a way that is similar to the African model, and, scholar that he is, cites Lester Young's solo in Lester Leaps In and Coleman Hawkins' Body and Soul as examples that depart from that model. He indicates that these latter approaches are expansions of the approach founded by Armstrong, as they stretch the connection between soloist and cycle without serving it. Brothers' purpose is to view pitch, which has been touted as the European contribution to jazz, and rhythm, touted as the African, as complementary components of a consistent melodic idiom, rather than as independent parameters having distinct antecedents. He maintains that the solo and cycle approach to syntax, eventually embraced by Armstrong's and others, came to jazz from earlier and simpler African-derived repertoires and provided the basis for the later model. This model, refined in various ways over the approximately 70 years of jazz's development, continues to embrace the many diverse and profound influences of African music on the formation of jazz. In melodies, as they are played by jazz musicians, for example, we hear microtonal inflections in pentatonic and modally ambiguous contexts, voices that are sometimes and variously rough, sandy, piercing, and falsetto, with vocal sounds that are sometimes used for their own value rather than for communication of verbal meaning, and with ease of movement from speaking to singing. We also hear ululations, grunts, hums, shouts, and melisma as integral and indispensable parts of the musical meaning of jazz renditions. In rhythm, we hear the influences of African music making in hand clapping, foot patting, and patting juba, in the repetition of short rhythmic motives, in cross rhythms, accented and in isolated second beats, and the rhythmic oscillations and call and response patterns of riffs and phrasings. In song texts, we hear and experience the influences of tales and legends told in metaphor, figures of speech, implication, indirection, and personification in call and response fashion. In musical phrases, we hear the influence of Africa in the sounds of the blue notes, African-style elisions, and other melodic assets of African-American singing style that resulted from African-Americans' use of the cultural, physical, and musical assets Africans brought with them to a new homeland in which jazz would be born. And that's the end of that article. Again, we're reading out of the Oxford Companion to Jazz. That was African Roots of Jazz. As soon as I can get this downloaded and uploaded to YouTube, I will put the YouTube link down in the comments. And If everyone likes this, I'll probably pick another article to read some other day, and we'll keep doing this. Thanks so much.